There is a late hour when the day has already given all it can give, and still the mind refuses to be done. The room is quiet, nothing useful can be changed now. Yet the same absence, the same mistake, the same lost possibility keeps returning as if night had opened a private door for it. It is easy to call this weakness or habit or overthinking. Those words can sound tidy for a minute. Then they fail because they do not tell the truth about what is happening. When someone cannot let go, they may be holding grief or guilt or loyalty. They may also be holding anger or the demand that life should have turned out differently. The phrase is simple, the burden is not. So the real question is harder than the advice people usually offer. What are we really holding when we cannot let go? The thing itself, the memory, the wish to reopen the past, a claim about justice, a version of ourselves that seems as though it would disappear if the grip softened. That is the question I want to stay with tonight. By the end of tonight, I want to leave you with a clearer way of telling memory from possession, love from ownership, responsibility from self-punishment, and acceptance from the cheap promise that pain should simply vanish. If you enjoy thinking through questions like this with me, subscribing to the channel helps others find them too. Sharing the video helps even more. Let's begin. The mind often returns to what it cannot solve only after the world has gone quiet. During the day, there are errands, requests, screens, voices, deadlines, small obligations that keep attention moving. At night, those outer demands fall away. What remains is not always peace. Often it is a kind of stripped room in which the old attachment becomes easier to hear. That is why this hour feels strange. The event may be over, the relationship may already be broken, the decision already made, the failure already committed, the loss already sealed into fact. Nothing external is still unfolding. And yet inwardly the matter behaves as if it has not reached its end. Thought circles back. The same scene arrives with new force. A conversation is replayed. An alternate answer appears too late. A future that did not happen is treated as if it remains available somewhere just beyond sight. If someone standing outside this experience says, "You need to let go," the advice can sound almost insulting. It uses one phrase for several very different realities. A person may be trying to let go of hope, or shame, or fury, or the demand to be understood, or the wish to be innocent again, or the fantasy of a repaired past, or the fear that if the pain eases, the significance of the attachment will be reduced with it. Ordinary language hides too much here. It pretends the object is obvious, but the object is exactly what we do not understand. When a hand refuses to open, that tells us little until we know what it believes it is protecting. Money, medicine, evidence, a promise, a name, a wound, an accusation, a relic of love. The same closed fist can mean devotion, panic, duty, superstition, vanity, or grief. The mind behaves like that closed hand. It says only one thing in 100 disguises: "I cannot release this." But every disguise changes the meaning of the sentence. If what is being held is loyalty, the problem is moral. If what is being held is control, the problem is impossible. If what is being held is identity, the problem is existential. If what is being held is a claim on reality itself, the problem is metaphysical. The phrase stays the same while the burden shifts underneath it. This is the first reason philosophy matters here. Philosophy does not arrive merely to decorate the pain with old names. It arrives because the first task is description. Before there can be any honest question about release, we have to ask what kind of bond this is. Is the mind staying close to something meaningful, or renewing a claim that cannot be honored? Is it protecting memory, or trying to turn memory into possession? Is it refusing indifference, or refusing reality? Consider how different the night feels depending on the hidden object. If the attachment is to a lost person, the mind may move between love, guilt, and anger without clearly separating them. If the attachment is to a mistake, the mind may confuse responsibility with endless self-prosecution. If the attachment is to a future that never arrived, the mind may treat possibility itself as stolen property. The emotional weather changes because the unseen object changes. Yet the person living through it often gives all of these states one name, and is then surprised that no single remedy touches all of them. There is also a difference between what hurts and what binds. Some things hurt because they were beautiful and then passed. Some bind because the mind keeps assigning them a current job. The old love must still validate who we were. The old injustice must still guarantee that the world can be judged. The lost chance must still explain why life feels divided. Pain belongs to many honest experiences. Bondage begins when the past is required to keep doing work in the present that it cannot actually do. The quiet room exposes this confusion because it removes the day's excuses. In daylight, we can say we are busy, distracted, making progress, doing what needs to be done. At night, that practical language weakens. The unresolved object returns without ceremony. It does not care whether we have performed wellness, maturity, or discipline. It asks a simpler thing. What am I still to you? That question is part of the torment. The attachment does not remain abstract. It asks for a relation. It asks whether it still governs how the past is interpreted, how the self is measured, how the future is imagined. No wonder the command to move on sounds shallow. Moving on from what? From a fact? From an obligation? From a betrayal? From a hope? From a self? So the first step is not release. The first step is honesty. Not being able to let go is not one experience. It is a cluster of different experiences that borrow one common phrase. If we keep speaking too vaguely, we will mistake one kind of burden for another and apply the wrong answer to all of them. There is a further reason this honesty matters. Vague suffering invites vague solutions, and vague solutions often deepen humiliation. A person tries detachment when the real problem is guilt. Another tries self-forgiveness when the real problem is ungrieved love. Another tries discipline when the real problem is a secret demand that time reverse itself. Another tries distraction when the real problem is that identity has welded itself to a vanished future. Each failure then appears personal. Why did this not work for me? Why am I still stuck? Philosophy answers by slowing the diagnosis down. Perhaps the method failed because the object was misnamed from the beginning. Perhaps you were never holding the thing you thought you were holding. There is something else hidden in this first confusion. We often assume that the thing returning must be the most important thing, but frequency and importance are not the same. Some thoughts recur because they are true. Others recur because they are unfinished. Others recur because the mind has learned to build part of its identity around them. A nightly return can therefore be a clue without yet being a verdict. It may tell us where attention keeps fastening itself, but it does not by itself explain why. That is why the first philosophical task is so modest. Before asking how to release the burden, ask what kind of burden it is. Even this first act of naming changes the atmosphere of the room. The mind is no longer forced to say only, "I am stuck." It can begin to say something more exact. I am grieving and also trying to preserve a self-image. I am angry and also bargaining with the past. I am loyal and also afraid that without this wound I will not know who I am. Precision does not make the burden small. It makes it less tyrannical. A thing that can be named in parts is no longer allowed to dominate as one mysterious whole. Then the real inquiry can begin. If the event is already closed, why does the mind keep treating it as present? A memory does not return like a neutral file. It returns already leaning toward a conclusion. That is why memory can feel heavier than the event itself. The event happened once. The memory arrives again and again, and each arrival often carries a judgment tucked inside it. Sometimes the judgment is obvious. This ruined you. This was stolen from you. This should never have happened. You failed when it mattered. You lost what you had no right to lose. Sometimes the judgment is quieter. This remains unfinished. This still belongs to you. This pain is proof of loyalty. This shame is proof of seriousness. This wound must remain open until it has earned a meaning large enough to justify it. Epictetus is useful here even before we reach his main distinction, because he teaches us to notice that an appearance is never only bare material. Something shows up to the mind and asks for assent. It arrives with a suggestion about what it is. A memory works that way. It appears with force, and the force is persuasive. The scene comes back, but it also says, "Read me in this way." That inner suggestion matters because it helps explain why two people can remember painful events and remain bound to them differently. One person remembers and grieves. Another remembers and relitigates. One person recalls the loss and feels sadness. Another recalls the loss and experiences it as a present accusation. The remembered material may overlap. The inward verdict does not. This is where ordinary speech is again too blunt. We say, "I keep thinking about it," as though the only problem were repetition. But repetition by itself is not enough to explain the grip. The thought has power because it is not merely a replay. It is also an interpretation. It says what the event means now. It says who was right, who was wrong, what must be repaired, what cannot be forgiven, what the self has become because of it. And that means the attachment is partly linguistic in the deepest sense. Not linguistic because it lives in words alone, but linguistic because the memory arrives already organized by a sentence, even if the sentence is never spoken aloud. He should not have done that. I should have known. It should have lasted. I should have become that person. They should have seen me. I cannot be finished with this because it still has something to say about me. The past event is fixed. The memory is a present occurrence. The verdict attached to the memory is another present occurrence. These are not the same thing. They feel fused because memory is intimate. It arrives from within. It feels like direct contact with what happened. But philosophy becomes possible only when the fusion is loosened enough to see the layers. That loosening does not diminish the event. A terrible event remains terrible. A real love remains real. A genuine injustice remains genuine. Distinguishing the verdict from the memory does not trivialize the content. It protects us from one further confusion. The belief that honoring what happened requires believing every claim the memory makes as it returns. Notice how often the verdict changes shape depending on the hour. In daylight, the same memory may appear manageable, almost factual. Late at night, it arrives with grander authority. It tells a total story. This was the moment everything was decided. This was the proof of what people are. This was where your whole future narrowed. The content of the memory may remain stable, yet the claim attached to it grows more sweeping. That is an important clue. It suggests that what binds us is not only the remembered event, but the present hunger for a final sentence about it. Marcus and Epictetus would both tell us to take that hunger seriously without obeying it too quickly. The mind loves total judgments because total judgments feel clarifying. If the memory proves everything, then at least confusion ends. But total judgments are often what keep attachment alive. A scene that means everything can never be set down gently. It must be consulted, defended, feared, and repeated. By shrinking the scene back to its truth, rather than its empire, philosophy begins to take away the false grandeur that recurrence keeps feeding. There are memories that tell the truth about the past while lying about the present. They say, because this mattered, it must still govern. Because this hurt, it must still decide who you are. Because this was unjust, you must keep the inner trial open forever. Because this was beautiful, you must preserve it through longing rather than let it become part of a life that continued. We start to see why the mind can know the event is over and still feel that it is not over. The event is over as event. The verdict keeps reopening it as present authority. That is where the philosophical labor starts to take shape, not in controlling what happened, and not even in preventing the appearance from coming, but in examining what the appearance asks us to affirm. Another way to say this is that the mind keeps confusing recurrence with unfinishedness. A memory comes back, and because it came back, we assume there must still be something left to settle inside the original event. But recurrence may tell us more about the present structure of the self than about the past structure of the event. The memory returns because it still serves a function. It accuses, protects, romanticizes, postpones, stabilizes, or demands. Until that present function is named, the mind will keep mistaking frequency for evidence. It will think that because the scene returns often, the scene itself must still be open. Sometimes what is open is not the event, but the identity or moral claim that has grown around remembering it. That difference can be felt in the way memory changes as soon as we ask what job it is performing. Suppose the old scene returns and instantly fills the room with shame. One possibility is that the shame is reporting a truth that still needs response. Another is that the shame has become the mind's preferred way of staying close to a version of itself it cannot otherwise recognize. In another case, the repeated memory may not be seeking judgment at all, but proximity. The person is gone, and replay becomes the last available form of contact. In still another case, the memory may be preserving protest. It refuses to let an injustice become ordinary. These are not small differences. They decide which philosophy is relevant and what kind of honesty is required. So the next question sharpens. If memory arrives before choice, where exactly can agency still be found? Stoicism is often misunderstood as a doctrine of emotional control. People hear the word and imagine a clenched interior, a program of suppression, a command never to feel shaken. That is too crude to help us here. Epictetus begins somewhere narrower and more exact. He asks what is up to us and what is not. The force of that question is easy to miss because it sounds obvious. Of course, some things are under our control and some are not, but Epictetus does not mean the ordinary difference between easy and difficult outcomes. He means something more severe. The event that already happened is not up to us. The other person's mind is not up to us. Reputation is not up to us. The body's vulnerability is not fully up to us. Loss, separation, aging, accident and death are not up to us in the sense that matters most. When attachment is active, the mind resists that sentence with all its strength. It keeps smuggling the finished event back into the category of the still negotiable. If I replay it enough, maybe I can revise it inwardly. If I suffer enough, maybe I can repay it. If I remain faithful to the pain, maybe the meaning will change. If I never stop wanting the other result, maybe reality itself will owe me one more hearing. Epictetus cuts through that dream with a hard clarity. What remains ours is not the event, but our faculty of judgment, our capacity for assent, our use of impressions. In Stoic language, the impression strikes first. The mind then has a task. It may accept the impression's suggested judgment, reject it, suspend judgment, or examine it further. This is not magical freedom. It is not freedom from having been hurt. It is freedom at the point where the mind is asked to ratify a claim. That is why Stoicism matters to the hour when you cannot let go. The Stoic does not say choose not to think about it. That would ignore how appearances actually work. A memory may arise without permission. A wave of anger may rise before a sentence is formed. A picture may flash with painful speed. The narrow place of agency is later than we often imagine, but it still exists. It exists when the memory says, "This means you are ruined," and the mind asks whether that is true. It exists when regret says, "You must keep suffering because suffering is the only honest sign that it mattered," and the mind asks whether this too is true. It exists when desire says, "The lost future is still owed to you," and the mind asks whether the claim belongs to reality or only to longing. This can sound small. In one sense, it is small. Stoicism does not promise command over the whole weather of the soul, but the smallness is also what makes it serious. Epictetus refuses the fantasy of omnipotence and locates dignity in a place that is narrow but real. A person may not be able to choose what rises in the night. A person may still choose whether every rising impression will be given the status of law. The moral strength of this position is easy to underestimate because modern culture admires scale. We want sweeping freedom, total healing, complete release. Stoicism does not flatter that desire. It says the human being is freer in a more modest and more demanding sense. Freedom is not found in ruling events, feelings, or outcomes. It is found in refusing to sign every inward document placed before consciousness. That sounds small until you realize how much of life is quietly directed by those signatures. Think of the difference between pain and endorsement. Pain can arrive uninvited. Endorsement is the further step by which pain becomes a worldview. Pain says, "This hurts." Endorsement says, "Therefore the whole future is damaged." Pain says, "This mattered." Endorsement says, "Therefore I must never cease revolving around it." Stoicism cannot prevent the first sentence. It trains us for the second. The training does not erase feeling. It guards against the expansion by which one event becomes a claim upon the whole order of being. That narrow freedom also explains why not being done with the past feels ethically loaded. If assent is involved, then the attachment is not only passive suffering, it is partly a present relation we continue to renew. That realization can sting. It threatens the comforting thought that we are only victims of recurrence. Yet it also gives back a kind of agency that is more honest than self-accusation. We are not omnipotent over the memory. We are responsible for what authority we keep granting it. One reason this can feel harsh is that assent is easy to mistake for feeling itself. A person hears the Stoic distinction and fears they are being blamed for every pang that rises in the night. But the distinction does not work at that level. The pain may be involuntary. The first shock of remembrance may be involuntary. Even the first sentence attached to the memory may arrive with extraordinary speed. Assent begins where the mind continues the sentence, decorates it, enthrones it, or gives it the rank of final truth. That continuation can be subtle. It may consist only in the refusal to ask whether the old interpretation is still adequate. Yet that subtlety is exactly why Stoicism remains useful. It does not demand miraculous mastery. It asks for honesty at the point where interpretation becomes allegiance. Still, Stoicism is not finished once that distinction is drawn. A listener could hear all this and say, "Fine, agency lies in assent." But what if that assent keeps getting renewed because the attachment feels morally justified? What if holding on seems less like a mistake and more like seriousness? Stoicism itself anticipates that difficulty because it does not imagine a detached brain examining neutral inputs. Human beings attach value, status, hope, shame, and loyalty to impressions. The mind does not merely receive a picture, it receives a picture already warmed by affection, fear, and pride. That is why assent is work. It is not work done on empty material, it is work done where pressure is strongest. The impression says, if you release this claim, you become frivolous. If you question this grief, you dishonor the beloved. If you let this anger soften, you betray justice. The Stoic answer is not to sneer at those pressures. It is to examine whether those moral dramatizations are true, or whether attachment is borrowing ethical language to protect itself from reality. Then the problem deepens. If control is this narrow, does the attachment shrink, or does it reveal itself as something more morally complicated than a habit of thought? Marcus Aurelius is often quoted as if he were a machine for calm sayings, but the real use of Marcus lies in repetition. He keeps returning to the same task because the mind keeps returning to disturbance. That is what makes him valuable here. He does not model one clean victory over attachment. He models practice. Again and again in the Meditations, Marcus reminds himself that a thing is not yet unbearable until opinion has joined it. Disturbance comes not only from the event, but from the way the mind frames the event in the present. That is easy to turn into a shallow slogan. We should resist that temptation. Marcus is not denying that harm exists. He is pointing to the place where harm continues to take shape inwardly as meaning. The past is closed as action, it remains open as interpretation. That open zone is where the attachment keeps living. A thought returns and says, "This was the end of your innocence," or "This proves what people are," or "This means the life you wanted was never truly possible." Marcus tries to interrupt exactly that kind of present issuance. He asks what the thing is, stripped of drama. He asks what belongs to nature, to chance, to another will, to his own judgment. Why is this repetition necessary? Because the first clarification does not stay clarified. The mind loves to restore its old stories. A morning of discipline can be followed by an evening of renewed verdicts. A week of relative freedom can collapse under one remembered phrase. Marcus teaches that returning to the work is not evidence of failure. The need to begin again belongs to the condition itself. That matters because people often measure themselves harshly when the same attachment returns after reflection. They think the recurrence proves nothing changed. Marcus would say the recurrence proves only that appearances are persistent and that judgment needs exercise. The task is not to reach a state in which nothing troubling ever appears. The task is to meet each appearance without surrendering instantly to the meaning it proposes. This is where Stoicism starts to look less like emotional minimalism and more like discipline of interpretation. The battlefield is not the archive of the past. It is the present opinion that the archive keeps releasing into the night. An old scene carries new force because the mind continues to pronounce upon it now. There is a humane modesty in this that is easy to miss. Marcus does not demand a dramatic inner performance. He does not say that a wise person stops feeling the pull of the old story forever. He writes as someone who knows how stubborn the old story can be. Each time he returns to the discipline of seeing clearly, he is admitting that clarity does not remain once achieved. It must be practiced because imagination, fear, vanity, and grief keep rebuilding their old arrangements. That practice resembles cleaning a lens more than constructing a monument. A lens clouds again, dust settles, light shifts. The need for maintenance does not prove the lens is defective. It proves that perception is exposed to the conditions of life. In the same way, the return of a painful interpretation does not prove that the mind learned nothing. It proves that judgment is vulnerable to renewal, and that vigilance belongs to wisdom far more than one decisive interior victory. This becomes easier to hear if we imagine a very ordinary case. A person wakes at 3 in the morning and remembers the exact tone in which somebody left, or the look on a face after a sentence that cannot be unsaid. The event itself is not in the room. What is in the room is a new act of reading. Suddenly the whole life seems to narrow around that old scene. Marcus would urge a second look. What exactly is present now? A body in bed, a remembered face, a thought moving quickly toward a total interpretation. The point of this second look is not to make the sorrow fake. The point is to stop the mind from confusing present interpretation with revealed destiny. There is also a quiet mercy in repeated practice. People often believe that if they have understood something once, they should no longer need to understand it again. But the mind is not a courtroom that issues one final judgment and closes forever. It is more like a city where the same rumor keeps returning by different streets. One night the old wound appears as anger. Another night it appears as humiliation. Another night it appears as longing dressed as innocence. Practice means recognizing the family resemblance among these arrivals and refusing to let each one declare itself the final truth about the whole life. But Marcus also protects us from a false conclusion. If the disturbance is partly opinion, it does not follow that the event never mattered. He is not saying the death was nothing, the betrayal was nothing, the departure was nothing, the humiliation was nothing. He is saying that making an event central to the whole order of the self is a fresh act, not a direct property of the event itself. That difference is morally important. Otherwise, Stoicism becomes a doctrine of emotional denial. The mature Stoic does not pretend the loss is small. He asks whether the present exaggeration, the claim that this one event authorizes a total verdict on life, is true. He keeps separating the thing from the added sentence around it. There is something deeply practical about that separation. Suppose the old scene says, "This happened, therefore nothing trustworthy remains." Marcus would answer by narrowing the claim until it can be tested. Did this happen? Yes. Did it hurt? Yes. Does it therefore follow that all trust is foolish, that every future bond is already condemned, that one event has earned the right to legislate over the whole remaining life? That is the question. The Stoic discipline is not emotionally barren because it keeps making exactly this move. It refuses to let a local wound become universal law without examination. At night, that refusal may be the difference between memory and fate. and once that universal law is interrupted, a little space appears for proportion. The injury can remain serious without becoming sacred. The failure can remain shameful without becoming the permanent definition of the soul. The loss can remain grievous without becoming evidence that life itself is now disqualified. Marcus keeps trying to win back that proportion, not because proportion is emotionally exciting, but because without it, the mind surrenders the whole future to one exaggerated reading of the past. So Marcus teaches a human lesson that is quieter than triumph. The mind will revisit. Practice is returning it, again and again, from total judgments toward what is actually before it. A closed event, a living present, a faculty still capable of responding. Yet a serious objection now appears. What if the attachment feels honorable? What if releasing the pain looks like disloyalty? What if the wound is being carried as proof that the person, promise, or loss truly mattered? There are attachments that remain because they hurt, and there are attachments that remain because letting them soften feels morally wrong. This second kind is often harder to face because the mind can wrap itself in duty. If I stop suffering this, maybe I am saying it was not important. If I stop replaying this person, maybe I am betraying them. If I stop punishing myself, maybe I am excusing what I did. That fear deserves respect. It cannot be answered with a quick distinction and a serene tone. Real love does not want to be reduced to technique. Real responsibility does not want to be dissolved into mood management. When pain has become part of the way we testify to value, any movement away from that pain can look like a moral retreat. Stoic ethics helps here because it distinguishes role and duty from inward possession. Epictetus and Marcus do not say that affection is an error or that duty disappears once an event leaves our control. They ask what loyalty actually requires. Does loyalty require permanent self-injury? Does duty require keeping a wound open as evidence? Does love remain love only so long as it continues to disable the one who remembers it? For the Stoics, the answer is no. A parent remains a parent, a friend remains a friend, a citizen remains a citizen, not because they endlessly reproduce the raw feeling of loss or offense, but because they continue to act well within the roles life has given. Responsibility belongs to present character and present action. It does not require indefinite inward possession of what cannot now be altered. This is difficult to hear because suffering has symbolic value. We sometimes use it as proof that the bond was real, proof that the wrong was serious, proof that we are not shallow enough to move on, proof that we did not forget, proof that the dead were loved, proof that the promise meant more than convenience. But symbolic suffering can become a counterfeit form of fidelity. It can feel noble while quietly doing nothing except preserving our relation to an inner image. A person may think they are honoring the beloved, when in fact they are clinging to their own need to remain the faithful sufferer. A person may think they are taking responsibility, when they are only refusing to let the self appear forgivable. Stoicism asks a painful question here. What concrete duty is still present? If there is apology to offer, offer it. If there is repair to make it. If there is care to continue giving, give it. If there is memory to preserve, preserve it. But if no action remains except the repeated inward rehearsal of pain, then we have to wonder whether we are still serving love and duty, or serving the identity that pain has made possible. That does not abolish grief. Grief is not disloyal. Relief is not betrayal. The softening of torment is not the same as the disappearance of meaning. A life can continue to honor what mattered without carrying the exact same temperature of injury forever. In fact, there are cases in which loyalty matures precisely by refusing to turn the loved thing into a shrine of endless self-consumption. There are rituals that honor without possessing, speaking the person's name, keeping a promise they valued, living in a way shaped by what was learned from them, telling the truth about the wrong that occurred, refusing to falsify the loss by pretending it was easy. None of these require perpetual inner bleeding as the badge of authenticity. They require steadier and often quieter forms of faithfulness. Think of the difference between carrying a photograph and pressing it so tightly in the hand that the edges bend. In both cases, the photograph remains important. In one case it accompanies life, in the other it is slowly damaged by the force meant to prove devotion. Many attachments work like that. The self keeps squeezing because squeezing feels like evidence. But evidence of what? That the bond mattered, that the event remains morally serious, that forgetting would be shameful. Those concerns are real. Still, squeezing is not the only way to answer them. Sometimes the more faithful act is to let the object stay intact enough to be seen clearly. This matters especially when the attachment concerns wrong rather than loss. A person may keep replaying a betrayal because dropping the heat feels like surrendering the moral fact. Yet the moral fact may survive perfectly well without endless inner arson. One can continue to judge an action as cruel, cowardly, faithless, or unjust, without requiring that every future night burn with the same intensity. Otherwise, judgment becomes confused with self-incineration. Stoicism asks us to separate these. The truth about the wrong can stay sharp while the mind stops feeding itself to that sharpness as the price of honesty. The reason this distinction is so difficult is that endless suffering can feel pure. It contains no compromise with ordinary life. It seems to prove that the attachment has not been diluted by chores, laughter, weather, sleep, or time. Yet that purity may conceal a temptation. If pain remains absolute, then the self remains absolutely tied to what was lost. Ordinary continuance feels messy by comparison. Loyalty has to survive inside changing life rather than outside it. Many people unconsciously prefer the symbol of perfect grief to the risk of imperfect continuance. Here Stoicism widens. The past relationship, the broken promise, the death, the failure all remain part of what calls for seriousness. But seriousness is not measured only by how long a person can remain inwardly torn open. Sometimes seriousness means asking whether the pain has become a substitute for action, or whether the attachment has become a private possession disguised as moral devotion. A person may discover, painfully, that what felt like devotion was partly fear of re-entering ordinary time. Ordinary time asks things of us. It asks that we keep living among chores, appointments, changing moods, other conversations, other dawns. If the pain remains sacred enough, one can almost stand outside that common flow and claim a more absolute allegiance. The trouble is that life is lived in the common flow. Duties to the living, duties to oneself, duties to truth all occur there. Loyalty that refuses ordinary time can therefore become a way of escaping the harder, less dramatic responsibilities that continuing life still demands. This is why loyalty has to be tested by what it makes possible, not only by what it preserves. If an attachment keeps a person from speaking kindly, from seeing clearly, from acting justly, from receiving ordinary gifts without suspicion, then the attachment may no longer be serving the value it claims to defend. It may be serving only its own continuation. A dead parent is not honored because every future joy is treated as theft. A betrayed promise is not honored because the soul becomes incapable of trust in any later form. A past wrong is not honored because the one carrying it learns to live as though all mercy were corruption. Loyalty that cannot enter the future without poisoning it has usually become possessive grief in moral clothing. So a new distinction comes into view. Care and clinging are not identical. Love and ownership are not identical. Responsibility and self-punishment are not identical. Once that is seen, the road toward Buddhism opens, because Buddhism asks even more directly what kind of demand is hidden inside the grip. If care can survive without possession, then what exactly is clinging trying to preserve? The Buddhist diagnosis begins from a hard form of realism. Life includes separation from what is loved, contact with what is unwanted, and the pain of not getting what is desired. This is not a side note in the Four Noble Truths. It is one of the central facts from which the analysis starts. Something hurts because something changes, leaves, decays, refuses, dies, or was never really ours to keep. That much almost everyone knows. The deeper Buddhist claim is that suffering is intensified by craving, by thirst, by the demand that the changing world satisfy our wish for permanence. The wound is not only that things pass, the wound is that we keep asking passing things to become stable enough to bear the weight of our need. This matters for the hour when you cannot let go because the mind often talks as though it is holding a thing, when in truth it is holding a demand. Make this stay. Undo that ending. Keep this person as mine. Keep this possibility available. Keep this version of me alive. Keep this innocence from being touched. Keep this future from collapsing into one unrealized path among many. The demand is easy to mistake for love, because both lean toward what they value. But love can recognize that the loved being is not an object to secure. Craving tries to convert significance into possession. It wants the changing world to give the certainty only fantasy can give. It wants contact without loss, nearness without time, meaning without vulnerability. When Buddhism speaks of clinging, it does not mean every memory, every preference, every devotion. It means the grasping movement that says the object must answer to me in a permanent way. That movement can attach to people, outcomes, identities, beliefs, even to pain itself. A person can cling to sorrow because sorrow seems to preserve a bond. A person can cling to anger because anger keeps a moral claim alive. A person can cling to regret because regret imitates continued agency. This is why the instruction to let go can sound false when it arrives without analysis. If the attachment contains love, grief, memory, and duty, then saying release it feels like saying become less human. Buddhism at its best does not say that. It says something narrower and more searching. Look for the place where care has turned into demand, where relationship has turned into possessiveness, where the refusal of change has become a fight against reality itself. Impermanence is the background to that diagnosis. The world does not offer us the kind of stable holding we keep requesting from it. Bodies change, bonds change, moods change, institutions change, interpretations change, even our own self-understanding changes. Clinging reacts to this by trying to nail experience in place. It wants the moving stream to become an owned container. That is why attachment feels exhausting. The mind is trying to maintain an impossible arrangement. It is asking flux to provide the certainty of a monument. No wonder the same memory has to be revisited. No wonder the same longing has to be refreshed. No wonder the same anger has to be rehearsed. Clinging is labor. It requires constant renewal because the world will not stand still long enough to ratify the demand on its own. That constant renewal can take surprisingly ordinary forms. A person may return to the same saved message, not because it contains new information, but because reopening it briefly restores the illusion that the relation remains available in the old shape. Another person may rehearse an old argument because the heat of the rehearsal feels more bearable than the colder truth that nothing further can now be won from it. Another may keep imagining a different outcome because imagination gives temporary shelter from finality. In each case, the object seems to be memory. The deeper object is still demand. There is also a hidden impatience inside clinging. It says that because something mattered, the world should provide a kind of exemption. This person should not have changed. This promise should not have broken. This chance should not have closed. This body should not have failed. Buddhism does not ridicule that protest. It understands why value makes us want exemption. What it denies is that value can abolish impermanence. The loved thing mattered precisely because it was finite and vulnerable. Clinging tries to keep the value while refusing the vulnerability. That is why it cannot rest. Still, Buddhism would be easy to mishear here. It is not saying that sorrow proves spiritual immaturity, or that desire is shameful, or that the answer is indifference. Those would all be distortions. The point is subtler. Pain belongs to a world in which things change. Suffering grows sharper when the mind turns change into an offense against its need for possession. This is why clinging so often feels righteous from the inside. The demand hides by dressing itself as moral necessity. I must not let the image fade. I must not allow the anger to cool. I must not admit that the future changed. But what sounds like seriousness may partly be a refusal to join the actual conditions of life. Buddhism does not mock the sorrow inside that refusal. It asks whether sorrow has started to recruit metaphysics, whether grief has started insisting that impermanent things should have been exempt from impermanence because they mattered to us. There is a severe tenderness in that Buddhist question. It does not say, you should have expected less. It says, because you loved, you asked a changing world for something it could never promise in that form. The sorrow is real. The error lies not in valuing, but in demanding that what was valued be protected from the conditions of all finite things. Once seen that way, clinging stops looking like depth alone. It begins to look like depth mixed with protest, devotion mixed with impossible metaphysical terms, love mixed with a refusal to let contingency be contingency. The challenge then is not to become less responsive. It is to stop asking the finite world for a form of security that the finite world cannot give. Once that challenge is heard clearly, the sentence "let go" starts to gain content. It no longer means drop the beloved, drop the memory, drop the moral fact. It means loosen the demand that reality keep offering the beloved, the memory, or the moral fact in the exact possessive shape your longing prefers. There is something almost humiliating in this, because it shows how much attachment can depend on invisible negotiation. The mind keeps saying, I will stop suffering once life admits that I was right to want permanence here. I will stop clinging once reality agrees that this loss should not have counted. I will stop replaying once the past returns what it already took. Buddhism answers with a refusal that can feel merciless at first. The world will not sign those terms. No amount of inward insistence can make finite things answer to an infinite hunger for security. Yet once that refusal is accepted, some wasted effort falls away. The person no longer has to keep arguing with change, as if change were a negotiable insult. Then the next question follows naturally. If clinging is not the same as love, what does non-clinging actually look like when the heart is still fully awake? Many people resist Buddhism at exactly this point, because non-attachment sounds like emotional evacuation. If I stop clinging, will I become cold? If I loosen my grip, will I lose tenderness? If I let the loved one, the lost future, or the painful memory stop ruling me, will I become one of those people who protects themselves by caring less? The fear is understandable, and if Buddhism could answer it only with emptiness as a slogan, the fear would remain justified. But non-clinging does not ask for a blank heart. It asks for a different relation to what the heart meets. The opposite of clinging is not apathy. It is contact without possession. This is where the grammar of I and mine starts to matter. A loved person can be deeply part of a life without becoming something one owns. A memory can remain precious without becoming a territory one must patrol forever. A grief can remain true without becoming the sole credential of love. Non-clinging questions the movement by which significance is converted into ownership. Ownership is tempting because it seems to promise security. If the object is mine, then its meaning is fixed, my claim is protected, and the uncertainty of the world has been mastered at least in one small place. But people are not property, futures are not property, innocence is not property, and even our own past is not property in the simple sense we wish it were. The attempt to own what cannot be owned turns significance into strain. Buddhist thought about non-self sharpens this further. The self we are defending in attachment is often less stable than it feels. We say, this happened to me, therefore it must remain mine in this exact way. Yet the self relating to that event is already changing. The one who remembers is not frozen at the scene remembered. Time has already moved through the person. Clinging tries to stop that movement and call the stop fidelity. Seen in that light, letting go starts to mean something much less dramatic and much less sentimental than people fear. It does not mean forgetting the beloved. It does not mean acting as though the injury was fine. It does not mean renouncing every strong feeling. It means releasing the claim that significance must take the form of possession. Love survives that release, because love was never best measured by ownership anyway. In many cases, love becomes clearer when ownership loosens. Instead of asking the other person, or the vanished possibility, or the remembered bond to continue securing the self, love can become gratitude, mourning, tenderness, admiration, even continued care where care is still possible. What disappears is the demand that the object remain inwardly held as if it were a guarantee. Memory also survives. In fact, memory may become more truthful once possession softens. A possessed memory is often forced to do too much. It must justify longing, preserve innocence, accuse fate, maintain identity, and prove seriousness. A remembered life can breathe more freely when it is no longer required to carry all those extra functions. Then the memory may become more exact, less theatrical, more capable of being honored without being used. One sign that ownership is loosening is that the object becomes more itself and less your mirror. The loved person ceases to exist only as the one who confirms your specialness or your abandonment. The mistake ceases to exist only as the scene that settles your whole moral worth. The lost future ceases to exist only as evidence that life wronged you. The object regains its own contours. That can feel like distance at first. In a deeper sense, it is respect. Respect is a useful word here because it sounds less glamorous than transcendence and more exact than detachment. To respect what was loved is to let it remain particular. It was this person, not a symbol drafted to explain your whole life. It was this hope, not the only possible shape of meaning. It was this grief, not a permanent throne from which all later joys must be judged as unworthy. Ownership flattens by forcing everything to serve the drama of the self. Respect restores contour. It lets the remembered thing keep its own edges even after it can no longer be held. This is also where non-self becomes less frightening. The point is not that there was no one there to love or no one here to suffer. The point is that the solid owner imagined by attachment is less stable than it appears. When the mind says, "This was mine and must remain mine in the old way," it speaks as though both the self and the object could be frozen. Neither can. The self changes while mourning. The meaning of the bond changes while memory remains. Non-clinging does not insult that reality. It yields to it. It says that truth is not protected by pretending that change has not already been happening everywhere. Non-clinging also changes the mood of remembering. The mind does not need to rush every memory toward a verdict. Sometimes it can simply say, "This happened, this mattered, this still hurts," and still refuse to build an empire around the hurt. That refusal is not coldness. It is a quieter form of care, one that no longer confuses constant inward handling with depth. This does not happen by command. That is one of Buddhism's most uncomfortable insights for modern minds. We want techniques that produce inner states on demand. Non-clinging refuses to become another possession. If I try to own detachment as an achievement, I have only given clinging a new costume. What often changes first is not the feeling itself, but the sentence attached to the feeling. The grief may still rise, but it no longer says with the same force that only endless sorrow can prove the bond was real. The memory may still sting, but it no longer says with the same authority that the self must build a home inside that sting forever. The old hope may still ache, but it no longer says that without this one outcome, the life has been invalidated. In that sense, non-clinging is less like emotional anesthesia and more like grammatical reform. The world is still loved, missed, mourned. It is simply no longer addressed as though it owed itself to us in a permanent possessive case. And that is why Daoism now becomes necessary. Once the will turns release into a project, another problem appears. The hand that says, "I must stop gripping tonight," may still be the same hand that refuses to open. There is a moment in many struggles with attachment when the mind becomes impatient with itself. Enough. I should be beyond this. I must stop thinking about it. I need to get over it. The desire for peace becomes a campaign, and the campaign quietly inherits the same structure as the original clinging. Daoism notices this with unusual elegance. In the Tao Te Ching, Wu Wei is often translated as non-action, but that can mislead. The point is not laziness, collapse, or passive surrender. The point is action that does not fight the grain of things, action that does not coerce reality into shapes it cannot hold. Wu Wei asks what happens when force itself becomes the problem. If attachment is already a form of tension, then forced detachment can simply double the tension. One part of the self clings, another part attacks the clinging. Soon the whole inner life becomes a wrestling match. The memory appears, and instantly a second voice arrives. Stop this, fix this, solve this, remove this. The night becomes not only painful but combative. This is why the language of winning against attachment often backfires. It gives the struggle a militarized shape. The self becomes both jailer and prisoner. The old thought must be defeated, the feeling must be silenced, the recurrence must be crushed. But the need to conquer keeps attention chained to the very object it wants to escape. Daoism offers a different picture. Instead of asking, "How can I overpower this bond?" it asks, "What in this whole struggle is unnatural strain? Where have I started to treat release as an achievement that can be seized by force? Where have I forgotten that some things loosen only when they are no longer being clenched from both sides?" This is harder than it first sounds because force often masquerades as sincerity. We feel that if we are not straining, we are not serious. If we are not wrestling, we are giving up. If we are not intensely trying to let go, we are indulging the attachment. Daoism says the opposite may sometimes be true. Strain can be the sign that we are still trying to dominate what cannot be dominated. Wu Wei does not mean doing nothing. It means acting without coercive excess. If apology is needed, offer it. If a boundary is needed, keep it. If a ritual of remembrance helps, practice it. If solitude makes the attachment stronger, change the immediate conditions of the night. All of that can be active. The difference is that the action is not organized by the fantasy that inner peace can be forced into existence through pressure. This is why Daoism can sound paradoxical to people formed by achievement culture. We are trained to assume that difficult states yield only to harder effort. If the mind is restless, work harder. If the feeling returns, tighten the discipline. If the wound stays active, increase the pressure. Daoism does not deny discipline. It asks whether discipline itself has become infected by domination, whether the supposed cure keeps the body and mind in the posture of attack. There is a bodily truth here as well. A person can feel the whole system brace around an attachment. The jaw hardens, the breath shortens, the attention narrows, the mind stares at the object as if staring were a form of control. Wu Wei invites another possibility, not passivity, but a less violent participation in one's own life. The thought arrives, the body notices, no immediate war begins. That alone can break a cycle that force keeps feeding. It helps to see how often force disguises itself as maturity. A person says, "I am finally taking this seriously," and what they mean is that they are pressing harder against themselves. They stay up later with the thought. They intensify the analysis. They accuse themselves of softness whenever tenderness or fatigue appears. Yet seriousness and violence are not the same thing. Inward force usually narrows perception. It keeps asking the same questions in the same tone until every answer sounds like failure. Non-forcing can therefore be more honest, not less, because it allows the mind to notice when the old thought has become repetitive theatre rather than inquiry. Daoism also protects the tempo of reality. Some things clarify quickly, others loosen only after long periods in which nothing dramatic seems to happen. A knot in a thread may hold for a long time even after the hand stops yanking at it. Water does not solve this by becoming angry at slowness. It keeps moving according to its nature. In human life, that may mean sleep, ordinary work, a walk, a conversation, or a period of silence doing more than another night of inner prosecution. None of this is miraculous. It is simply a refusal to believe that force is the only sign of truth. Here, Daoism begins to protect the dignity of process. Not every bond can be dissolved on command, and not every recurrence is a sign of failure. Sometimes the problem is intensified by the impatient insistence that release must already have happened. The river is ordered to become still immediately, and the ordering keeps stirring the water. That image matters because the attachment itself may partly survive through constant agitation. When we keep grabbing at the thought to push it away, we keep granting it centrality. The mind says, "This must not be here," and in saying that, continues to build its inner world around the thing rejected. Many lives are quietly organized by this second struggle rather than the original loss. The first bond hurt. The later war against still hurting becomes its own prison. A person begins measuring every day by whether the feeling returned, whether the image appeared, whether the night was calm enough, whether the old sentence lost ground. Soon the inner life has become managerial. The attachment is no longer only remembered, it is monitored. Daoism breaks that spell by lowering the prestige of management itself. It asks whether the self has started treating sovereignty over mood as the only acceptable proof of wisdom. Once that vanity is exposed, some gentleness becomes possible, and with gentleness a different kind of strength. So the next step is to understand non-forcing more concretely. If release is not an achievement to seize, what kind of strength does softness represent? The Tao Te Ching returns often to water, and it is easy to sentimentalize that image. Water becomes a decorative symbol for calm. But in Taoist thought, water matters because of how it moves. It benefits without competing. It yields without ceasing to be powerful. It takes the shape of what it enters without losing its own nature. That makes water a useful image for the hour of attachment, because the mind is usually doing the opposite. It is contending. It is bracing itself against what has already happened. It is trying to sharpen one remembered edge until the edge can cut through reality itself. The past is over, but the mind keeps grinding the blade. The Tao Te Ching warns that what is overfilled cannot be preserved. What is over-sharpened does not keep its edge. These are not only political or practical observations. They describe interior life with surprising precision. A memory can be polished until it no longer teaches and only wounds. An analysis can be sharpened until it stops revealing and starts trapping. An emotional claim can be kept so bright that it blinds the one carrying it. That does not mean memory must go dull in the sense of becoming vague or false. Taoist softness is not forgetfulness. It is the refusal to keep turning the same object against oneself after understanding has stopped increasing. Water continues moving. It does not establish worth by remaining rigid. Think of how often attachment feeds on a false promise of one more insight, one more replay and I will finally understand, one more night of reliving it and the hidden answer will appear, one more act of mental return and the pain will pay me back by becoming meaningful enough. Sometimes understanding really does deepen through return. Just as often the returns become circular. The motion persists while the discovery ends. Water helps because it offers another relation to repetition. Water repeats, but not by remaining fixed. It passes the same banks by moving onward. Taoist softness suggests that one can remain in relation to a memory without making the relation a locked posture. The memory comes, and instead of contesting it or embalming it, the mind may allow it to appear, take its shape, and pass without converting it instantly into renewed combat. This is not weakness. In many lives it is harder than fighting. Fighting gives the self a role. It lets us feel active, righteous, embattled. Softness removes that drama. It asks whether the self can endure contact without immediately making contact into a duel. It asks whether the mind can stop proving its seriousness by remaining tense. Water is powerful partly because it does not insist on one shape. Attachment often survives by insisting on one shape for everything. The relationship should have remained this. The apology should have sounded like this. The self should have become this. The future should have opened here. Water answers with a more patient intelligence. It moves around what resists it without claiming that resistance has thereby vanished. That patience matters in the life of the mind. A person can stop insisting that clarity arrive only in the form of a final interior victory. That patience is not moral laziness. It can include very exact attention. Water notices the contour it meets. It does not pretend the rock is not there. Likewise, a patient mind does not deny the wound. It notices where the wound hardens into repetitive narration, where memory sharpens into self-harm, where longing turns into a secret demand that the world undo itself. Softness, therefore, has an intelligence that brute discipline often lacks. It can tell the difference between returning to something because more truth is there, and returning because the self has become attached to the drama of return itself. Softness also changes what counts as progress. If progress is measured only by absence, then every recurrence looks like defeat. But if progress means less compulsion to sharpen, less appetite to overfill, less need to turn return into combat, then real change may already be taking place inside a mind that still remembers often. Daoism lets us measure that subtler movement without degrading it into a motivational metric. The overfilled cup is another useful warning. We try to make one attachment carry too much. It must preserve love, preserve identity, preserve justice, preserve innocence, preserve meaning, preserve the specialness of a lost future. No single remembered object can bear all that. Under such pressure, memory spills into obsession and devotion curdles into possession. There is a second lesson in water that matters just as much as softness. Water does not deny gravity, it answers to it. It moves with conditions, rather than spending itself pretending conditions do not exist. The mind at night often does the opposite. It tries to impose a private law on the past. This should still be open, this should still be reversible, this should still belong to me in the old way. The insistence feels strong, but it is brittle because it is fighting what is already hardened into fact. To move more like water is not to approve of the fact. It is to stop measuring sincerity by rebellion against finality. And there is endurance here as well. Softness is often confused with brief feeling, something delicate that appears for a moment and vanishes under pressure. Taoist softness is sturdier than that. It persists without locking itself. A memory may continue to visit for years. The softer relation does not demand that the visits cease at once. It asks only that each visit stop becoming a summons to total war. Over time, that changes the whole climate of remembrance. The past may still return, but it returns to a mind less eager to weaponize every recurrence against itself. Daoism does not solve the whole problem. It does not tell us what memory is, or why identity attaches itself to loss so fiercely, but it clears a path. It shows that force can intensify the thing it opposes, and that softness can be a form of intelligence rather than surrender. Once that is understood, we are ready to ask a more exact question about the past itself. Why does the event feel so personal even when the mind knows it is finished? Part of the answer lies in the nature of memory. Modern philosophy of memory helps here because it refuses a lazy metaphor. Memory is not simply an archive from which the mind retrieves stored material like files from a shelf. Episodic memory, in particular, is a way of accessing one's personal past. To remember is not merely to know that something happened. It is to stand again in a relation to that happening as part of one's own life. That is why remembered scenes can feel more intimate than facts learned from outside. I may know that a city burned, that a war ended, that a stranger died, and all of that knowledge can be serious. But when I remember a conversation I myself had, a face I myself touched, a door I myself closed, the relation is different. The past returns under the sign of mindness. This happened in my time, in my body, in my world. That mindness is not a mistake. It belongs to personal memory. The problem begins when personal access is transformed into continued possession. Because the event remains available as mine in memory, the mind starts to feel that it remains mine in a stronger sense than reality can support. What is personally remembered starts to masquerade as what is still personally ownable. This helps explain a confusion that Stoic and Buddhist thought only partly address on their own. A person can know intellectually that a relationship ended, a chance disappeared, a loved one died. An offense cannot be reversed, yet memory keeps restoring the sense of intimate nearness. The past is over in one register and vividly mine in another. No wonder the self becomes divided. Memory does more than replay content. It also positions the self. It tells us where we were, how we were touched, what sort of person we seemed to be then, what kind of future once appeared open. It can therefore feel like a duty to remain faithful to the remembered scene. If I loosen my attachment, perhaps I am loosening the truth of my own past. But faithfulness to the past does not require turning memory into a shrine. A memory can be accurate without being sovereign. It can remain part of the personal past without becoming the ruler of the personal present. That distinction is delicate because memory is emotionally persuasive. It makes the past feel near enough to reclaim, accuse, or repair. Episodic memory also has a viewpoint. It comes from somewhere. It does not present the whole event from nowhere in particular. It presents the past through the structure of my experience. That means memory is honest and partial at once. It discloses something real while still being shaped by perspective, selection, and later interpretation. The attachment often forgets this. It treats the remembered scene as final evidence rather than situated access. That situated quality explains why memory can feel truer than any external correction and still remain incomplete. Another person may remember the same conversation differently. A diary entry may show that the mood of the time was more mixed than the recollection now allows. Later knowledge may reveal that what looked like a final rejection was partly confusion, limitation, fear, or chance. None of this means the memory is fake. It means personal access is not the same as perfect possession of truth. Once we admit that, memory loses some of the authority attachment likes to give it. It remains intimate, but it can no longer serve as unquestionable proof for every verdict the present wants to build. The remembered scene says, "This happened to me." It does not automatically say, "Therefore all my current conclusions about myself, the other person, and the shape of reality are final." That small reduction of authority can make room for mercy, complexity, and a less tyrannical relation to the past. Consider how memory often behaves around a room or an object. A cup on a shelf, a winter street, a certain song, a way light falls through a doorway. None of these contains the whole past, yet each can unlock the old scene with sudden force. The experience feels absolute because it is vivid, but vividness is not the same as completeness. The remembered doorway is one angle on a life, not the entire verdict on that life. When we forget this, we let sensory nearness impersonate philosophical totality. This also explains why memories can become more tyrannical when they are left unexamined. The less we distinguish recollection from interpretation, the more every return arrives already enlarged. A glance becomes proof, a phrase becomes destiny, an omission becomes a whole account of who we are. Philosophy of memory does not cool all this by skepticism alone. It cools it by precision. Yes, the scene is yours in the sense that it belongs to your past. No, that does not make every later meaning claimed in its name equally yours by right. Once that distinction is felt, remembering can remain personal without becoming imperial. Once we see that, a new danger appears. Memory can become a substitute for relation. Instead of relating to the dead through mourning, gratitude, or changed life, we relate through obsessive return. Instead of relating to a lost chance by living the life that remains, we relate by preserving an internal theatre in which the chance never entirely disappears. Memory keeps the object close, but closeness slowly becomes possession. This is why some remembrances feel clean while others leave a residue of compulsion. In the cleaner sort, the memory arrives, discloses something true, and returns the mind to life with a slightly altered tenderness or understanding. In the compulsive sort, the memory demands immediate repetition. It says, "Not enough, again, look harder, suffer more, hold tighter." The difference is not that one is emotional and the other is detached. The difference is that one allows relation while the other keeps trying to manufacture possession. Once that distinction is noticed, the mind can begin to ask not only whether it remembers, but how it remembers. This does not mean we should distrust all remembrance. It means we should ask what the remembrance is doing. Is it letting the past be part of the living self, or is it trying to make the past available for permanent inward handling? The first may be fidelity. The second may be another form of refusal. This question becomes especially sharp around cherished scenes. The best evening with someone now gone, the rare moment when a parent seemed fully understood, the almost accepted offer, the conversation after which everything changed. Such scenes feel too precious to surrender to analysis. Yet analysis here is not desecration, it is protection. Without it, precious scenes are easily forced into impossible labor. They must keep proving that love was unique, that the lost future was rightful, that the self was once whole, that destiny made an unforgivable mistake. Memory then ceases to witness the past and starts conscripting the past into present ideology. To examine that shift is not to insult the scene, it is to save it from being turned into a tyrant. And that refusal leads us toward identity itself. If memory feels like part of the self, what happens when the attachment is no longer only about the event, but about the kind of person one would be without it? Philosophers of personal identity often distinguish between the technical question of persistence and the practical question of characterization. The first asks what makes a person the same person over time. The second asks what features, commitments, memories, loyalties, and values seem to define who that person is. For our problem, the second question matters more. Many attachments remain powerful because they help hold together a self-story. I am the one who loved her. I am the one who failed there. I am the one who was wronged in that way. I am the one whose life divided at that point. I am the one who almost became that other version of myself. Remove the attachment, and the narrative coherence feels threatened. This is why letting go can resemble self-erasure. The mind fears that if the bond softens, the person who carried it will also soften into vagueness. The wound becomes a landmark. The regret becomes a spine. The lost future becomes an organizing myth. Even the pain becomes structure. It tells the self where it stands in relation to its own history. There is a grim comfort in this. Identity built around attachment may be painful, but it is stable in one important sense. It gives the self a recognizable plot. Without it, a frightening freedom appears. Who am I if I am no longer the injured one, the faithful one, the abandoned one, the guilty one, the almost one, the deprived one? If that role loosens, what remains? No wonder people cling to stories that hurt them. The hurt is not the whole attraction. The attraction is legibility. Suffering can make the self readable to itself. To release the attachment would not merely remove pain. It would demand a less fixed understanding of who one is. Personal identity theory helps by refusing the fantasy that any one episode can simply equal the self. A life contains many strands. Memory offers evidence of continuity, but memory is not the entire person. Character matters, but character is not exhausted by one injury or one devotion. The self persists through change more ambiguously than attachment likes to admit. This ambiguity can be threatening. It is easier to say, "This event made me who I am," than to inhabit the messier truth that many things shape us, and that our relation to a defining event can itself change without falsifying its importance. A person can stop organizing everything around a wound and still remain the person to whom the wound happened. What frightens us is not only losing pain, it is losing legibility. If the attachment softens, we may have to meet parts of ourselves that pain had kept hidden, curiosity that had been suspended, desire that felt disloyal, ordinary pleasures that seemed too small for the gravity of the old story, new obligations that do not fit the role of permanent sufferer. To many people, that openness feels less safe than the old wound, even when the wound is exhausting. That is why identity rarely loosens all at once. The self has to discover that it can remain continuous without constant reference to the same injury or absence. New forms of coherence have to be lived before they can be believed. Philosophy cannot do that living for us. It can, however, expose the false necessity by which the mind says, if this stops defining me in the old way, then I become no one. That is a liberating thought only after it has first felt dangerous. At first it sounds like betrayal of one's own history. It sounds as though the past is being reduced, yet the opposite may be closer to the truth. When the self is fused with one attachment, the rest of life is reduced. Every other loyalty, curiosity, capacity and relation is forced to orbit the same fixed center. To loosen that fusion is not to deny history, it is to admit that the self is larger and less tidy than the role attachment assigned. The lost object remains real, the failed action remains real, the injustice remains real, but the self is not obligated to remain permanently shaped around the same single tension in order for those realities to stay true. The imagination often resists this by inventing a false alternative. Either the wound keeps organizing me, or I become shallow. Either the old love remains central in the same dramatic way, or it meant less than I claimed. Either the regret keeps burning, or I am morally unserious. Philosophy's work here is not to manufacture a new identity at once. It is to expose the falseness of the alternative. Depth does not require permanent domination by one memory. Seriousness does not require one fixed emotional temperature. A person can remain marked without remaining ruled. That larger self is often hard to trust because it does not announce itself with the same theatrical certainty as the wounded role. The wounded role knows its lines. It knows how to interpret new events. It knows how to turn every fresh happiness into a test of loyalty, and every new possibility into an accusation of betrayal. A larger self is quieter. It may include reverence for what was lost, but also appetite, laughter, boredom, curiosity, skill, work, tenderness towards strangers, affection for weather, interest in ideas, and a dozen other ordinary forms of life. To the old attachment, this can look like dilution. In truth, it may be the return of proportion. Social life deepens the problem. Other people may know us through the very wound we are trying not to be ruled by. They remember the breakup, the failure, the death, the public disgrace, the illness, the long season of obsession. Their memory can harden our own because it makes the role feel publicly certified. But even here, identity is not fixed once and for all. A person may honor the visible mark of the past while slowly refusing to let it remain the whole public meaning of the self. That refusal is not denial. It is a way of telling the truth about continuity without accepting imprisonment. One way to feel this is to notice how suspicious the attachment can become toward any evidence of plurality in the self. If laughter returns, the mind may whisper that laughter is betrayal. If curiosity returns, curiosity may feel frivolous. If affection for someone new appears, it may seem like treason against the old bond. If ambition wakes again, ambition may look shallow beside the gravity of what was lost. The attachment prefers a simple character because simple characters are easier to keep under one ruling interpretation. But real persons are not simple in that way. They are capable of grief and appetite, reverence and boredom, moral memory and fresh desire. Identity becomes more truthful, not less, when it stops pretending that one wound has the right to veto every other living capacity. Still, there is one place where identity and attachment combine with unusual force, and that is regret. Regret often feels like the last defense of a self that cannot bear to accept the closure of agency. Regret speaks as if the past still contains a door. That is what gives it its special cruelty. It does not merely say, something bad happened. It says, something still could have gone differently if only you had been wiser, braver, slower, quicker, cleaner, less vain, less frightened, more honest. The event is over, but regret behaves as if an alternate action remains inwardly available. This is why regret can become addictive. It offers counterfeit agency. So long as I keep replaying the scene, maybe I am still doing something about it. So long as I keep suffering over the choice, maybe I remain morally active in relation to it. So long as I do not forgive myself, maybe I am still honoring what the moment required. Stoicism answers first. The past act is no longer up to you. That does not erase responsibility, but it locates responsibility in what remains possible now, not in infinite inward reopening of what cannot be redone. Buddhism adds a second insight. Regret often includes craving for a different world than the one that happened. Daoism adds a third. The desperate effort to force peace through self-attack only deepens the knot. Identity theory adds a fourth. The self may cling to regret because regret has become part of how seriousness is performed. Together, these insights make regret look different. Regret is not pure conscience. Sometimes it is conscience, sometimes it is grief, sometimes it is love, but often it is also refusal. Refusal to accept that the one chance is gone. Refusal to let the self become the kind of creature that can do wrong and still continue living. Refusal to move responsibility from the irreparable past into the unfinished present. That unfinished present matters. Real regret can guide present action. It can teach, humble, restrain, clarify. It can lead to confession, restitution, changed conduct, gentler judgment of others, better care. But when none of those are possible or needed, regret may remain out of proportion because its true object is not morality but closure itself. The mind hates that a morally charged scene can be finished. Self-punishment enters there. It feels responsible because it hurts. Yet pain is not always repair. A person can torment themselves for years without becoming more truthful or more just. The suffering creates the illusion of continued engagement. It says, "Look how much I still feel this. Surely that must count for something." Sometimes it counts only as persistence. There is a severe difference between staying answerable to the past and staying chained to its most unproductive theatre. Answerability can be quiet. It can take the form of changed conduct, an altered standard, a willingness to name what was done, a refusal to repeat the same harm. Chaining oneself to the theatre of regret is different. It keeps returning not to learn, but to preserve the feeling that nothing has been closed. When regret is seen in that light, one more question becomes possible. If the mind stopped reopening the scene, what would it fear losing besides punishment? Often the answer is contact with the self that acted there. Regret seems to keep that earlier self available for trial, but perhaps responsibility to that earlier self no longer requires trial. Perhaps it requires witness, truth, and a different present life. This is hard to say because there are cases where continued regret does mark real moral seriousness. We should not empty the category. Some harms deserve lifelong humility. Some losses should leave a permanent mark. The danger lies in confusing the mark with the repeated reopening. Humility can remain without reenacting the same courtroom scene every night. The closed event and the open present must be separated. The event is closed. Its meaning in the life is still open. That is where work remains. What kind of person will I be now? What can I still make true now? What form of seriousness is possible now that self-attack cannot restore the vanished moment? It helps to distinguish two kinds of regret that often fuse together. One concerns wrongdoing. I lied, I betrayed, I failed a duty, I harmed someone when I should have acted otherwise. The other concerns lost possibility. I should have spoken, should have stayed, should have left earlier, should have risked more, should have understood in time. These are not identical, even though both can produce the same nightly torment. The first may require apology or restitution where possible. The second often tempts us into an impossible fantasy of perfect foresight. If we do not separate them, remorse becomes muddled and the mind starts punishing itself without knowing for what. There are also regrets whose moral residue is real but limited. Perhaps no apology can now be heard. Perhaps the other person is gone. Perhaps the life that would have received repair no longer exists in any active form. In such cases, the demand grows almost severe in its simplicity. What would fidelity to the truth of that failure look like now, in conduct rather than theatre? Maybe it means speaking differently to the next person. Maybe it means refusing a familiar vanity. Maybe it means becoming slower with anger or less cowardly with love. Regret begins to change only when it consents to lose the old stage and accept the smaller but truer stage of the present. There is another form of regret that deserves special caution. Sometimes the mind regrets not a wrongdoing, but a path not taken. It clings to a possible self as if that possible self had moral rights over the actual one. The lost career, the unwritten letter, the road not followed, the courage not shown at 25 or 40 or 60. Here remorse can disguise fantasy. The mind keeps imagining that if only one turn had gone differently, the whole life would now feel justified. But no one lives all possible selves. Part of maturity lies in grieving unrealized forms of life, without treating their non-existence as proof that the present self is illegitimate. That shift from the closed event to the open present is often where people feel a sudden drop in drama and mistake the drop for moral failure. The old inner courtroom was intense. It gave every night a severe script. Charges were restated, counter-arguments were drafted, sentences were renewed. Moving into the present can feel almost ordinary by comparison. Yet the ordinary is where actual moral life takes place. The apology that can still be made, the pattern that can still be broken, the humility that can still be practiced, the care that can still be given, the honesty that can still be chosen. Regret keeps wanting one last chance inside the old scene. Responsibility asks something harder and quieter. Become better where you are now, not where you can never again stand. Once we stand there, a harder possibility enters. Maybe acceptance is more than discipline, more than non-clinging, more than non-forcing. Maybe the whole life containing the wound must be faced. That is where Nietzsche arrives, and he arrives without gentleness. Nietzsche is dangerous in exactly the way sentimental philosophy is not. He does not come offering peace, inner balance, or a reassuring theory of why everything happened as it should. He is not interested in making suffering bearable by placing it inside a cosmic guarantee. He is interested in whether life can be affirmed without being edited into innocence. The phrase amor fati, love of fate, is therefore easy to cheapen and difficult to understand. It does not mean liking every event. It does not mean pretending cruelty is good or loss is secretly a gift. It means something harsher. Can you stop treating the unwanted parts of your life as arguments against the whole of your life? Can you cease making war on reality because reality did not protect you from pain, humiliation, accident, or irreversible error? This question pushes beyond Stoic assent. Stoicism can ask us to stop granting a destructive verdict. Buddhism can ask us to loosen craving. Daoism can ask us to drop strain. Nietzsche asks whether even after all that, resentment still sits underneath, keeping one secret reservation alive. Yes, life continues, but only after I have inwardly marked certain parts as unacceptable. That is why Nietzsche is no comfort philosopher. He takes the part of attachment that remains proud of its refusal. The mind says, I will not call this acceptable. Nietzsche's challenge is not that one should call it acceptable in a moral sense. It is that one should ask whether the whole habit of standing over life as judge, demanding revision before assent, has become another prison. For someone who cannot let go, this is severe medicine. Part of the attachment may be resentment toward the shape life took, not only toward what another person did or what chance allowed, but toward the fact that one's own existence includes this wound at all. The inner speech becomes, my life would be legitimate if only this one part were removed. Nietzsche hears that sentence and presses on it. He presses because he suspects that human beings often divide themselves by trying to affirm life under conditions. I will say yes to my life once the humiliation is cut away. I will belong to my own existence once that love is restored or undone. I will inhabit fate once fate apologizes. Nietzsche asks whether that conditional relation keeps us permanently estranged from what is. In that sense, Nietzsche is diagnosing a refinement of the same possessive impulse we met earlier. The mind wants not only a different event, but a different totality. It wants life itself to come bearing guarantees suitable to its pride and sorrow. If those guarantees are not provided, life remains under suspicion. Nietzsche asks whether that suspicion has become more faithful to our vanity than to the truth of existence. This is why his thought can feel almost indecent to bring near real suffering. It enters where people are still injured and says, yes, but what is your final relation to the fact that reality was never organized around sparing you? That is not a tender question. Still, it may be necessary, because hidden underneath many attachments is exactly that scandalized protest against finitude, yet we must guard against a common distortion. Nietzsche is not saying everything happens for a reason. He is not saying one should celebrate abuse, loss, stupidity, illness, or disaster. He is not offering the vulgar toughness that internet culture often borrows from his name. He is naming a test of spirit, not a slogan of triumph. That distinction matters because easy consolation can wear philosophical clothing. It can say that fate arranged everything well, that suffering arrives as hidden instruction, that the painful event was always meant for your highest developments. Nietzsche would despise that comfort. It removes offense by inventing a flattering universe. Amor fati is harsher because it asks whether one can stop bargaining even when no benevolent explanation appears. Nothing is rewritten as a gift. Nothing is padded by cosmic sentiment. The event remains ugly where it was ugly. The challenge concerns your relation to that ugliness as part of one life, rather than the universe's relation to you as its favored student. Resentment is therefore more than anger. Anger can be lucid and morally necessary. Resentment is anger that quietly wants metaphysical compensation. It says, if no restoration comes, then existence itself stands condemned. This helps explain why some attachments survive even after every practical question has been exhausted. There is no message left to send, no argument left to win, no action left to reverse. What remains is the wish that life itself admit fault. Nietzsche exposes that wish with unusual brutality. He asks whether the soul has made inward peace conditional on an apology that being itself will never provide. That test matters because it keeps the entire conversation from sliding into consolation. Perhaps we can distinguish memory from verdict, love from ownership, duty from punishment, and still remain secretly committed to bargaining with life. Nietzsche removes the bargain. He asks whether one can live without requiring reality to become retrospectively innocent. Seen that way, Nietzsche is less a preacher of hardness than an enemy of hidden conditions. He keeps asking what terms the soul is placing on its consent to existence. Must the past be revised? Must the humiliation be redeemed by a visible compensation? Must suffering become useful before it can be tolerated? Must life apologize before it can be inhabited? Those demands are understandable. They are also endless. Reality cannot meet them. When attachment persists through resentment, it often persists because some impossible condition is still being preserved as the price of inward peace. Nietzsche tears up the contract and asks who you are without it. Another way to feel the force of this is to notice how often attachment speaks in conditional futures. I could live if only that one fact were removed. I could respect myself if only that one scene had gone differently. I could belong to my own biography if only this humiliation did not sit inside it. Nietzsche hears the word if only as a sign that the soul is still bargaining with existence. He does not deny the pain behind the bargain. He asks whether the bargain has become more beloved than life itself, whether a person would rather preserve the condition than enter a reality that will never satisfy it. This is why Nietzsche can feel both liberating and intolerable. He strips away one of the last comforts available to resentment, namely the belief that refusal itself is a kind of superiority. The attached mind often says, "At least I did not become one of those people who settled for reality." Nietzsche answers by asking whether this supposed superiority is only another chain. If your dignity depends on never consenting to a life that wounded you, then your dignity has become dependent on the wound. The very thing you refuse continues to organize the self. That recognition does not dissolve pain. It does expose a hidden loyalty to pain's authority, and that exposure is already a kind of movement. Many cannot answer yes. Perhaps no one answers yes cleanly. That is part of Nietzsche's honesty. Amor fati may name not an attained state, but a horizon that exposes how much hidden negotiation remains in us. That is why Nietzsche should be read less as a command and more as a diagnostic pressure. He is not standing at the bedside of suffering saying, "Love this at once." He is asking what secret clauses still govern your willingness to belong to your own life. Must your biography be purified before you will inhabit it without resentment? Must every humiliation be redeemed by later superiority? Must every loss become useful before it becomes bearable? Must existence prove itself worthy of you before you stop prosecuting it? These questions are merciless. They are also clarifying, because attachment often survives by smuggling these conditions into the soul without naming them. And once that horizon appears, another thought experiment follows. What if the life that contains this attachment did not occur once, but again and again? Nietzsche's thought of eternal recurrence is sometimes presented like a puzzle about the universe, but its real power is existential. Imagine, he says, that the life you have lived, with all its moments, great and small, wanted and unwanted, must return again and again in the same sequence, not because the cosmos is kind, but because the question exposes your relation to your life. For someone haunted by one attachment, this thought cuts directly to the nerve. Could I bear not only remembering this loss, this failure, this abandonment, this compromise, but living the whole pattern again? Could I say yes to a life that includes this exact wound without treating the wound as a clerical error to be removed before the life becomes lovable? The first response is often horror, and the horror is instructive. It reveals where resentment is deepest. It reveals which parts of the self still say, "Anything but this again." That response should not be mocked or overridden. It belongs to moral seriousness. Some experiences should not be romanticized. Some harms do not become beautiful by being named necessary. That objection is crucial, because otherwise eternal recurrence becomes another brutal self-help slogan. The point is not to admire pain. The point is to test the degree to which we are at war with the shape of our existence. The thought experiment asks whether our yes to life is large enough to include what cannot be surgically removed from the biography. This becomes delicate when the attachment concerns another person. To imagine the recurrence of a lost love is not merely to imagine more pain, it is also to imagine more beauty, more vulnerability, more exposure, more uncertainty, more dependence on chance. A life scrubbed of pain would not simply remove anguish, it might also remove what made affection, courage, and risk possible at all. The thought experiment, therefore, unsettles simplistic wishes. Sometimes we say we want the pain removed, when what we really want is the whole encounter kept while its cost is deleted. Nietzsche's will not allow that fantasy. If you remove the wound completely, what else vanishes with it? Which tenderness, which courage, which disclosure, which dangerous happiness belonged to the same fabric? The question is not meant to trap us into gratitude. It is meant to reveal how selectively we imagine existence when resentment takes the lead. At the same time, recurrence can clarify where one's no must remain. There are things that should still be refused, still be judged, still be named disastrous or cruel. The honest point is not that every no disappears. It is that the self learns the difference between saying no to evil and saying no to life as such. Attachment often blurs those together. Nietzsche forces them apart. That does not justify every loss. It does remind us that our hatred of one part of life often expands into hatred of life as a structure. The mind says, if this can happen, then nothing is trustworthy enough to affirm. Eternal recurrence pushes that thought to its edge. Will you reject the whole because one wound cannot be forgiven? Or can you refuse beautification while still refusing total negation? This is why recurrence is a pressure test, not a doctrine to memorize. It does not tell us what to think. It reveals how much of our attachment is really attachment to a preferred metaphysics of existence, a wish that life were constructed to spare us the forms of contingency that define it. Once that wish is exposed, the attachment grows more legible. Recurrence also drags the ordinary back into the picture. Not only the dramatic wound would return, but but the Tuesday fatigue around it, the weather on the day after, the awkward silence at breakfast, the weeks when nothing noble happened and one simply kept going. This matters because attachment often edits life into peaks. It remembers the betrayal, the kiss, the funeral, the error, the sentence, and forgets the wide plain of ordinary living that surrounded them. Recurrence restores the plain. It asks whether one can bear not only the great pain again, but the whole texture of being the person to whom that pain belonged. That broader frame changes the meaning of affirmation. To affirm a life in any honest sense is not to clap for every event. It is to refuse the dream that only a purified biography deserves consent. A life always arrives mixed. Courage and pettiness, devotion and vanity, insight and blindness, tenderness and damage are braided together. Recurrence asks whether attachment has become a covert demand for an unbraided life. If it has, then the grip may persist because reality keeps refusing a perfection it never promised. This is where recurrence becomes strangely intimate. It is not only the great drama that returns, it is the self who interpreted the drama, the habits of reaction, the pride that wanted exemption, the tenderness that was real, the blindness that was real, the ordinary weather of the days around the wound. That is why the thought experiment is harder than simple optimism and more serious than theatrical despair. It asks whether the soul can bear its own full texture rather than only its selected highlights. Attachment often survives by rehearsing a purified version of the injury. Recurrence refuses purification. There is, however, a boundary that must be preserved. Some events should remain terrible. Some losses should not be reframed as hidden blessings. Some wrongs should not be folded into cosmic gratitude. Nietzsche is valuable precisely because he can be resisted. His test is illuminating even where his answer feels unreachable. Resistance itself can teach something here. If a person hears recurrence and feels an immediate no, that no may contain several elements at once. It may contain moral protest against genuine evil. It may contain ordinary fear of pain, but it may also contain wounded pride, the refusal to be part of any reality that does not flatter our preferred image of justice. The work is not to erase the no. The work is to sort it. Which part belongs to truth? Which part belongs to vanity? Which part belongs to grief? Which part belongs to the impossible wish that life should have been arranged to spare us from being finite creatures exposed to accident, change, and irreversible time? In that sorting, recurrence keeps doing its severe but useful labor. That resistance is part of the honesty of the argument. A person may understand the challenge and still refuse the conclusion. It may be possible to see how resentment chains one to the event and still be unable to call the event lovable as part of fate. That refusal does not mean the thought experiment failed. It may mean it did its work. Nietzsche is not here to extract gratitude. He is here to make visible how much of attachment is bound up with a demand that existence justify itself on our preferred terms. So we arrive at the closing stretch with more rigor than comfort. Acceptance cannot mean pretending the wound was good. It cannot mean demanding that every listener love fate in Nietzsche's strongest sense. What, then, can acceptance honestly mean? By now, the word acceptance should feel both thinner and heavier than it did at the start. Thinner because many things people place under that word no longer fit. Heavier because what remains is not easy or sentimental. Acceptance is not forgetting, it is not excusing, it is not becoming indifferent, it is not saying the pain was useful, it is not rewarding the one who hurt you, it is not forcing release, it is not spiritualizing defeat. Stoicism has taught us one part of this. Acceptance is not surrendering judgment to every memory that returns. The event and the present verdict about the event are distinct. One can refuse to keep renewing a destructive sentence without denying the seriousness of what happened. Buddhism has taught another part. Acceptance is not ceasing to care. It is loosening the movement by which care becomes ownership and by which change becomes an outrage against our wish for permanence. Memory may remain, love may remain, sorrow may remain. What softens is the claim that significance must take the form of possession. Daoism has added something indispensable. Acceptance is not another campaign of inner force. It does not come from tightening around release until release breaks. It belongs more to ending the unnecessary fight than to winning it. It resembles a hand that stops trying to prove its strength by staying clenched. Memory and identity theory have complicated the whole matter further. Acceptance is not amnesia toward the self. A life includes its defining moments. But identity need not remain imprisoned by the same organizing wound. The past can remain part of who one is, without becoming the entire form of selfhood. That is a demanding freedom. It is still freedom. Regret, too, has been clarified. Acceptance is not moral laziness. It does not deny responsibility, confession, restitution, or lifelong humility where those are required. It does deny the fantasy that endless self-reopening is a substitute for present seriousness. The past action is closed. The present relation to that past remains open. That is where responsibility now lives. Nietzsche leaves the sharpest residue. Acceptance is not consolation. It does not promise that you will one day be grateful for every wound. It does not ask you to call evil good. It asks whether you will keep treating the unwanted part of life as an objection to life itself, whether resentment will remain your final relation to what cannot be revised. Gathered together, these traditions do not hand us a technique. They give us distinctions. Memory is not possession. Love is not ownership. Duty is not self-punishment. Non-clinging is not indifference. Non-forcing is not passivity. Regret is not proof that the past can still be changed. Identity is not exhausted by one attachment. Affirmation is not the same as comfort. Honest acceptance, therefore, has a strange appearance. It may still cry. It may still hesitate. It may still return to the same place inwardly more times than pride thinks respectable. What changes is not that the old material vanishes, but that it loses some of its rights. It no longer has the right to call itself the entire truth about the self. It no longer has the right to demand ownership over what can only be remembered. It no longer has the right to prove seriousness by exhausting the one who carries it. This is why acceptance often looks less dramatic than the fantasies sold under its name. There may be no shining moment in which the whole weight dissolves. There may instead be a season in which memory arrives and, little by little, commands less ceremony. A season in which regret stops drafting the same indictment. A season in which love remains but becomes less possessive, grief remains but becomes less imperial, responsibility remains but becomes less theatrical. None of that is glamorous enough for self-help. Those distinctions do not make the night painless, they make it more honest. And honesty matters because false endings are seductive. We want cure, closure, clean release, a final emotional click that announces the work is over. Philosophy, at least good philosophy, disappoints that appetite. It leaves us with a truer map rather than a guaranteed arrival. One reason that disappointment is valuable is that false endings often produce new forms of self-contempt. A person is told that the goal is complete release, then finds that memory still returns, grief still stirs, regret still flares, love still aches. Because the promised ending does not arrive, the person concludes that they have failed. A more honest picture spares that needless humiliation. The attachment may remain active in some ways even while its structure changes profoundly. What changes first may be invisible from outside. Less worship of the verdict, less urge to turn memory into ownership, less need to make pain the sole proof of seriousness, less force used against one's own mind, less secret bargaining with life. These are not dramatic victories, they are still real. They amount to a different relation to the same returning material, and that relation may matter more than any fantasy of pristine detachment. This is also where philosophy shows its difference from simple encouragement. Encouragement often says, "Keep going, things will get better." Philosophy says something stranger and in the long run more durable. It says that even if the old memory returns tomorrow, it need not return with all the same rights. Even if grief remains, grief need not govern the whole house. Even if regret still stirs, regret need not reenact the whole courtroom. Even if love still aches, love need not become ownership. This is not a promise that the difficult thing will disappear. It is a claim that the difficult thing can be met with better distinctions, and that better distinctions alter the shape of a life even before they alter the temperature of a night. This is also why acceptance should be judged by its consequences in the life, rather than by the purity of a feeling. Does memory arrive without immediately claiming sovereignty? Can grief coexist with ordinary tenderness toward the day that remains? Can regret become instruction more often than self-annihilation? Can love survive without trying to own the vanished object? Can the self imagine a future not wholly governed by one old wound? These are modest tests, but they are more trustworthy than any grand declaration that one is finally free. If those tests sound small, that is part of their seriousness. Grand declarations are easy at 2 in the afternoon. A calmer memory at 1 in the morning is harder won. A little less self-theatre after regret is harder won. One less demand that the world undo itself is harder won. Philosophy earns its keep in these smaller victories, because these are the places where an actual life changes. The past stays what it was. The relation to the past ceases, little by little, to be the only law in the room. And perhaps this is the most realistic kindness philosophy can offer. Not the promise that one day the old attachment will feel as though it never mattered, but the promise that mattering and ruling are different things. A memory may matter and still lose its throne. A love may matter and still stop claiming ownership. A regret may matter and still give way to present seriousness. A loss may matter and still cease to dictate the meaning of every later hour. That is not a cure. It is a form of freedom honest enough for mortal lives. It is also enough to keep a person from despairing over the unfinished nature of the work. The attachment may not vanish, and still its grammar can change. It may return, and still not govern. It may hurt, and still not own the whole night. That quieter victory is easy to overlook because it does not announce itself with spectacle. But a life is made from such changes. One less lie told by memory, one less impossible demand laid on reality, one less night ruled by the same old verdict can already mean that the soul is living differently. Sometimes real is enough for one night, enough to loosen the fist a little, enough to let one memory stop pretending to be the whole life. Perhaps that is enough to change the hour in one important way. The mind returns and says, "I cannot let go." The old answer was shame, impatience, or a slogan. The new answer is a slower inquiry. What exactly am I trying to hold here? Which part deserves care, and which part is secretly a demand to possess? Which part belongs to memory, and which part belongs to resentment? Which part is love, and which part is fear of becoming no one without the wound? That is already a different posture. It does not solve everything. It does make confusion less sovereign, and sometimes that is the beginning of a more humane relation to what stays difficult. The room at the end is not very different from the room at the beginning. It may still be late, the phone may still be silent, the other person may still be absent, the mistake may still be part of your history, the dead may still be dead, the unlived life may still remain unlived. Philosophy has not altered those facts. What it may have altered is the shape of the question moving through the room. At the start, the burden may have looked like weakness. Why am I still here? Why can I not release this? Why does the same thing keep rising? Those are understandable questions, but they are often too blunt to tell the truth. Tonight has tried to slow the experience down enough to see its parts. The event is one thing, the memory of it is another. The verdict carried by the memory is another again. Love is one thing, ownership is another, duty is one thing, self-punishment is another, regret is one thing, the fantasy of reopened agency is another, acceptance is one thing, consolation is another. These distinctions do not remove tenderness, they protect tenderness from confusion. If you loved, that love does not become false because possession softens. If you were harmed, the harm does not become trivial because resentment no longer governs every night. If you failed, seriousness does not disappear because self-attack grows quieter. If you remember, the memory is not dishonored because it no longer rules as law. Some attachments remain because they still contain living care. Some remain because they contain unfinished moral work. Some remain because the self has built a home inside the wound. Some remain because craving keeps asking change to reverse itself. Some remain because the mind is still trying to own what only time can carry. Most contain several of these at once. That is why one slogan never helps for long. The good news, if that is the right phrase, is not that one final answer has now been found. It is that confusion has been divided into more truthful parts. Once that happens, the burden is no longer forced to wear one crude name. Sometimes what returns needs witness. Sometimes it needs moral action. Sometimes it needs surrender of impossible claims. Sometimes it needs patience with the body's slowness. Sometimes it needs a refusal to let identity keep feeding on old drama. The night remains difficult. It stops being shapeless. Perhaps the cleanest thing to say now is that letting go was never the whole task. The real task was learning what must be released, what may be remembered, what can still be acted on, what can no longer be possessed, and what sort of self is speaking when the night says, "Hold this a little longer." You may still be unable to let go in any complete sense. That may remain true tomorrow as well, but perhaps the next return will be met differently, not with a demand that you become harder, cleaner, faster, more detached by force, not with the accusation that recurrence proves weakness, not with the fantasy that peace requires erasing significance. Instead, the mind can ask a better question. What exactly am I being asked to hold here? And what exactly am I being asked to stop possessing? That question leaves room for grief, room for love, room for duty, room for memory, room for moral seriousness, and also room for reality to remain reality. That may be the most honest form of release available in this hour. Not the disappearance of attachment, not a promise of closure, only a clearer way of meeting what returns, so that the past is no longer confused with the right to own the whole present.